Hi, how are you? Today I'm going to tell you the story of a single woman during the winters of the Middle Ages. It's a beautiful story that's a wonderful blend of history and fiction where you'll both learn something and let your imagination run wild. Sit back and relax. First, I'd be very happy if you could take a minute to leave a comment saying which country you're watching from and subscribe to my channel. I wish you all peaceful nights. Agnesot woke in the deepest, blackest hour of a January night in the early 13th century to a silence that told her, before she had even opened her eyes, that something in her small cottage had gone badly wrong. It was not the wind she failed to hear, since the storm outside her single shuttered window still howled exactly as it had when she banked the fire before sleep, but rather the absence of the fire's own low, familiar crackle, a sound so constant through every winter night of her 29 years, that its sudden disappearance struck her, even half asleep, with an alarm sharper than any noise could have produced. She sat up on her narrow straw pallet in the single room she had occupied alone since her mother's death 2 winters before, and reached instinctively toward the hoard in the cottage's center, her fingers finding only cold, dead ash where the careful bed of embers she had banked before sleep should have continued smoldering quietly through the night, exactly as it had every night she could remember. Agnesot was, in the particular language medieval English communities used to describe her situation, a spinster in the most literal, occupational sense of that word, an unmarried woman who supported herself primarily through spinning wool into thread for the local weavers of her small Yorkshire village, a trade that offered genuine, if modest, independence to women who, for whatever combination of circumstance, had not married or had been widowed without remarrying, a category of medieval women whose lives surviving manorial and parish records document with rather more frequency and rather more independence than popular assumption about the period sometimes allows. She had never married, her own modest dowry prospects and her family's limited standing having left her, by her late 20s, in exactly the position many medieval women of similarly modest means eventually occupied, supporting herself through her own steady labor rather than through a husband's household, a position that offered her genuine autonomy over her own small cottage and her own daily choices, but that also meant, on a night like this one, that no husband's stronger hands stood ready to help her manage whatever crises had just extinguished the single fire standing between her and a cold that, in the deep heart of a genuinely severe English winter night, could prove very quickly and very genuinely lethal. She worked quickly in the near total darkness, her hands moving through the familiar motions of trying to coax the last, faintest embers back to life, motions every medieval household member understood as essential survival knowledge regardless of age or station, since fire represented, across every level of medieval society from the humblest cottage to the wealthiest manor hall, the single most critical resource standing between a household and the genuine, well-documented danger that severe winter cold posed to human life. Her efforts, however, found nothing to work with at all. No faint orange glow, no residual warmth beneath the ash, only cold, spent fuel that told her. With a dawning, genuine fear she worked hard to master, that whatever had happened while she slept had not simply banked the fire too thoroughly, had extinguished it entirely, hours before dawn, in weather severe enough that surviving Paris records from exactly this kind of period document real, if not overwhelming, numbers of deaths attributed to cold among precisely the isolated, single-person households that a woman living alone represented. Agnesette's mind, working now with the same clear, practical urgency that had carried her through 2 winters of managing her mother's former calmer cottage entirely alone, moved rapidly through the limited options her situation actually offered. Her small store of dry kindling, kept specifically for exactly this kind of emergency, sat in a covered basket near the hearth, and she reached for it, now with hands already beginning to feel the bite of the room's rapidly dropping temperature, understanding with genuine clarity that rekindling fire from cold ash and fresh kindling, without any surviving ember to build from, represented a considerably more difficult undertaking than simply feeding an already living fire, requiring the careful, practiced use of her flint and steel tools that demanded steady, warm enough hands to strike an effective spark, a requirement that grew more difficult with every passing minute. The room continued its steady, dangerous slide toward the kind of colder single, unheated cottage offered no defense against beyond the fire she was now working desperately to rebuild from nothing. It was as she knelt by the cold hearth, striking her flint against hair steel with hands already growing clumsy from cold, and the genuine fear she could no longer fully suppress, that, as she heard it, a sound from outside her cottage, distinct from the storm's own considerable noise, that might have been nothing more than a branch torn loose by the wind, or might, as her racing, increasingly frightened mind immediately suggested, have been something considerably more deliberate, a sound that made her hands go still over her useless, cold flint and steel, and left her straining in the sudden, terrible silence of her own held breath to determine whether she had truly heard footsteps circling her small, isolated cottage in the middle of a storm that should, any reasonable expectation, have kept every other living soul in her village safely behind their own closed doors. The sound came again, closer now and unmistakable, even over the storm's own considerable noise, a distinct, heavy footfall in the drifted snow just beyond her cottage's north wall, and Agnesette found herself facing, in the space of a single frozen, listening moment, a decision that every isolated, medieval household understood as genuinely, sometimes fatally significant, whether to call out and risk revealing herself to whatever moved outside her walls, or to remain silent and continue her desperate, urgent work, rekindling the fire that represented her only real defense against the cold, regardless of what other danger the night might also hold. She chose silence, drawing on the same practical caution that had shaped her survival through 2 winters alone, and returned her shaking hands to the flint and steel with a deliberate, forced steadiness, understanding that whatever walked outside her cottage, an animal driven by the storm's own severity to seek shelter near human habitation, a genuine intruder, or simply the wind playing its familiar tricks on a frightened mind already primed toward alarm by the fire's sudden, inexplicable failure. Our most immediate, uncertain danger remained the cold itself, a threat considerably more reliable and considerably better documented across medieval winter mortality than whatever uncertain danger the footsteps might or might not represent. Her third strike of flint against steel finally produced the spark she needed. Catching in the dry tinder she had carefully prepared and held ready exactly for this kind of emergency, and she nursed the small, fragile flame with the same careful, practiced attention every medieval household member learned from earliest childhood, feeding it first the thinnest, driest kindling before daring to add anything heavier that might smother the still vulnerable young fire before it had genuinely taken hold. As warmth and light slowly began returning to her small cottage, Agnesot found her racing heart beginning, gradually, to steady alongside the growing fire, though the memory of those distinct footsteps outside her wall remained lodged firmly in her thoughts, refusing the easy dismissal she might otherwise have granted a storm's ordinary, unremarkably noisy. It was only once her fire burned steadily enough to illuminate the cottage's single room with genuine, reliable light that Agnesot noticed the detail that transformed her earlier general alarm into something considerably more specific and considerably more disturbing. Her cottage door, which she remembered with complete, genuine certainty barring securely before sleep, exactly as she did every single night of her life alone, now stood with its wooden bar sitting slightly askew, skewing in its bracket. Not fully dislodged, but shifted in a manner that suggested, with an implication she could not easily explain away as mere imagination or ordinary settling of old timber, that someone or something had, at some point during the night's darkest hours, attempted the door from outside with deliberate, careful pressure entirely inconsistent with wind alone, however severe the storm's continued fury against her cottage's thin, vulnerable walls. Agnesot spent the remainder of that night wide awake beside her rebuilt fire, unwilling to trust sleep again until genuine daylight offered her the chance to examine her cottage's exterior properly and determine whether her fear reflected real, concrete danger or simply the ordinary anxiety frightening, disorienting hour of cold darkness could produce in even the steadiest mind. She used the waiting hours productively, feeding her fire with the same careful attention she always applied to this precious, essential resource, and turning over in her thoughts the practical question that had genuinely troubled her since first waking to find the fire dead. Banked fires, prepared with the same care she applied every single night of her adult life, simply did not extinguish themselves entirely without some specific cause. whether a draft strong enough to have found its way through some gap in her walls she had not previously noticed, insufficient fuel left in the bed of embers before sleep, or in a possibility she found herself unable to fully dismiss, despite every instinct urging her toward a more mundane explanation, some deliberate interference by a hand other than her own. Dawn arrived with the storm finally beginning to ease, and Agnes sought, examining Hare Cottage's snow-covered exterior in the pale, uncertain early light, found evidence that confirmed her worst suspicion beyond any reasonable doubt: footprints, already partially filled by continued light snowfall, still clearly discernible to her careful, searching eye, circled her cottage's north and west walls, in a pattern that no animal's tracks could explain, boot prints, unmistakably human, that approached her door directly before turning away again, following a path that suggested someone had indeed stood outside her home in the deepest, coldest hours of the storm, testing her door's security before withdrawing, for reasons Agasset could not begin to guess, without ever forcing entry at all. She considered, standing in the cold, clear morning air with her own breath clouding before her, who among her small village might have reasoned to approach her isolated cottage under cover of a genuinely dangerous storm, and found herself unable to settle on any single, satisfied explanation. Village gossip, she knew well from her years living among neighbors who had watched her manage her independent, unmarried life with the particular mixture of respect and quiet unease that surviving records suggest often greeted women in her position, occasionally speculated about her situation in ways she generally worked hard to ignore, speculation touching on everything from genuine concern for a woman living alone, without a husband's protection, to less charitable, more suspicious murmuring about exactly what kind of independence a woman her age, unmarried and self-sufficient, might quietly pursuing behind her own closed door. Whether the previous night's visitor represented some genuine threat connected to this same undercurrent of village suspicion, a simple traveler desperate enough to test a stranger's door during a dangerous storm before ultimately continuing on rather than risk the genuine social and legal consequences of forcing entry into a woman's home, or something else entirely that Agnetha's own limited knowledge could not yet help her understand. She found herself standing alone beside her own cold, snow-covered doorstep in the pale light of a morning that offered considerably more questions than answers, genuinely uncertain whether the danger that had visited her cottage in the night had truly passed, or whether it might yet return with the same deliberate, patient purpose once darkness. Agnetha decided, weighing her limited options with the same practical clarity that had guided every significant decision of her independent life, that the wisest course lay in seeking out the one person in her village whose judgment she trusted most completely, and whose position gave her some genuine standing to help Mother Osanna, an elderly widow who had known Agneset's own mother for decades, and who had, since that mother's death, taken on something of an informal, watchful role in Agneset's life, without ever presuming to interfere in the independence Agnesot had worked so carefully. Tomantine. She made her way through the storm's melting aftermath toward Osana's own cottage, closer to the village center than her own more isolated dwelling, and found the older woman already awake and tending her own morning fire, a fire that Agnes Aswat noted with a fresh, uncomfortable jolt of unease. Burned exactly as steadily and reliably as fires across the village presumably had, through the same night that had left her own hearth mysteriously, inexplicably dead. Osana listened to Agneset's account with the careful, weathered attention of a woman who had survived considerably more winters and considerably more all of the village's ordinary dramas than her younger visitor, and offered, once Agneset finished describing both the fire's strange failure and the footprints she had found circling her walls, a piece of information that shifted the entire shape of Agneset's growing fear. She was not, Osana revealed with evident and genuine concern, the only woman in the village to report something unusual during the previous nights. The widow Christiana, living alone at the village's eastern edge since her own husband's death the previous spring, had apparently reported to her own nearest neighbor that morning finding her small store of dry firewood kept carefully stacked beside her cottage's outer wall, and partially buried in snow drifts that fresh tracks suggested had not occurred through the storm's own natural action and alone, a detail that Osana, turning the matter over with visible, growing unease of her own, found difficult to dismiss as simple coincidence once set alongside Agnesot's own considerably more direct and personal experience. This new information settled over Agneset with a weight considerably heavier than her own isolated incident alone had carried, since a single strange occurrence at her own cottage might reasonably be explained through some combination of natural misfortune and an overactive, frightened imagination working upon ambiguous evidence, but two separate incidents, both targeting women living alone without a husband's household to offer additional protection or witness, both involving interference with the specific resources, fire and fuel, that stood most directly between an isolated household. Genuine winter danger suggested a pattern considerably more deliberate and considerably more troubling than either woman's individual experience could support alone. Osana, drawing on her own decades of accumulated knowledge of the village's history and its occasional darker undercurrents, admitted quietly that she could recall from years past at least one similar period of trouble targeting isolated women during a particularly hard winter, trouble that had, at the time, never been fully explained or resolved before, simply, mysteriously ceasing as the season eventually turned toward spring, a precedent that offered Agnesot considerably less comfort than she had hoped to find in seeking out her older friend's experienced steady counsel. Addie, Agneset asked Osanudibly what had Ut ultimately explained, or explained, Lane, that earlier period of trouble the old woman now recalled, and received an answer that offered little genuine resolution, but considerably more historical grounding for a kind of danger isolated medieval women could face. Some in the village had, at the time, whispered of ordinary human malice, perhaps a jealous rival, a spurned suitor, or simply cruel village youths finding entertainment in frightening women who lacked a husband's presence to deter such behavior, while others, drawing on the same complicated mixture of Christian teaching and older, half-suppressed folk belief that shaped so much of medieval understanding regarding misfortune, had murmured about darker, less easily explained possibilities, suspicions that, in later decades and in other regions of Europe, would eventually harden into the kind of formal witchcraft accusations that historians have documented extensively, targeting exactly this category of women, independent, unmarried, or widowed, and lacking the protection a husband's household and reputation typically provided against a community's darker suspicions. Osanna, watching this last possibility visibly trouble her younger friend, cautioned Agnesot directly against allowing her own fear to readily towards such dangerous speculation, since the same currents of suspicion that might, in theory, position Agnesot and Christiana as potential victims of some human malefactor could, with troubling ease, equally well turn to position one or both women themselves as suspected sources of whatever misfortune the village's imagination chose to construct around two strange, unexplained incidents occurring on the very same storm-battered night, a genuine, well-documented danger that surviving records of medieval and early modern witchcraft accusations confirm repeatedly struck exactly this kind of vulnerable, independent woman as easily as it might strike any genuine wrongdoer, sometimes considerably more easily, given how readily suspicion could shift from victim to accused once village gossip and fear began working upon ambiguous, frightening events that lacked any clear, satisfying explanation. This warning left Agnesot facing a considerably more complicated calculation than she had carried with her into Osanna's cottage that morning, understanding now that whatever had genuinely happened during the storm's darkest hours, whether human malice, simple misfortune, or something she still could not fully name even to herself, her own best course of action likely required a delicate, careful balance, taking genuine, practical steps to protect herself and to understand what real threat she and Christiana might actually face, while simultaneously avoiding any appearance or accusation that might redirect her villagers' fear and suspicion toward her own person, rather than toward whatever or whoever had genuinely disturbed both women's homes during the same dangerous night. She thanked Osanna for her counsel and her genuine concern, and made her way back toward her own cottage, as the day's pale winter light continued strengthening, her mind already turning toward the question of whether she ought to seek out Christiana directly to compare their two experiences in fuller detail, a conversation that might offer genuine, useful clarity, or might, depending on who else in the village noticed and interpreted two isolated women conferring privately about matters touching on strange, unexplained, explained misfortune, simply add fresh fuel to exactly the kind of dangerous speculation Osana had so carefully warned her against inviting. Agnesa chose, in the end, a cautious middle path, deciding to approach Christiana not through any obvious public visit that village eyes might easily notice and interpret, but through the ordinary, unremarkable cover of the Allah wife's small brewhouse near the village center, a genuinely common gathering point where women from across the parish regularly exchanged news and gossip during the daily business of purchasing ale, a setting that surviving records of medieval village life confirm functioned as one of the period's genuine, informal information networks, particular men whose daily labor and limited mobility offered fewer other opportunities for exactly this kind of casual, low suspicion social contact. She found Christiana there by early afternoon, the other woman's face carrying the same pale, watchful strain Agnes herself had felt since waking to her own cottage's dead fire, and the two women working carefully to keep their conversation within the bounds of ordinary concern, even as they exchanged genuinely significant detail, pieced together an account considerably more troubling than either had managed to construct alone. Christiana's own experience, once described in full, revealed details that sharpened rather than resolved the mystery both women now faced together. She had heard, before discovering her scattered firewood, a sound she initially dismissed as an animal disturbing her stores, but that she now recalled, prompted by Agnesot's own account of deliberate, testing footsteps, as considerably more purposeful and considerably more human than she had allowed herself to fully consider at the time, a memory she admitted with evident discomfort. She had perhaps unconsciously softened in the retelling, specifically to avoid the very fear Agnesot's own more direct experience had now forced her to confront regardless. Both women agreed, in the careful, lowered tones their public setting demanded, that whoever or whatever had visited their homes that night appeared to share a specific, troubling pattern, targeting not random households across the village, but specifically the homes of women living alone, and specifically threatening the exact resources, fire and fuel, that represented an isolated household's most basic defense against the genuine, well-documented danger severe winter cold posed to anyone lacking adequate warmth through the season's coldest, most dangerous nights. It was as this careful, quiet conversation drew toward its close, both women having agreed to remain watchful and alert one another immediately should any further strange occurrence disturb either household, that a third woman, someone Agnesot recognized only vaguely as a recent arrival to the village, approached the brewhouse counter with a request that struck both Agnesot and Christiana, listening now with newly sharpened attention to any detail touching on their shared concern, as carrying unexpected, immediate relevance. The stranger asked the alewife, in a manner that suggested genuine urgent need rather than idle curiosity whether she knew of any household in the village currently in need of additional labor or lodging, explaining, when pressed gently for further detail, that she herself had recently arrived seeking exactly this kind of arrangement, having left her own previous situation some distance to the south, under circumstances she described owned only in the same vague, deliberately incomplete terms that immediately struck Agnesot's own now practiced, wary attention as bearing an uncomfortable, possibly significant resemblance to exactly the kind of careful evasion she herself had learned across this single long and frightening night, to recognize it as a warning sign worth taking seriously rather than dismissing. Agnesot, drawing on the same careful, unassuming manner he had used throughout her conversation with Christiana, engaged the newcomer in the kind of ordinary, welcoming small talk any village might reasonably extend toward a stranger seeking work, learning through this gentle, unpressured exchange that the woman gave her name as Editha and claimed to have traveled from a village some 3 days south, following the loss of her previous position in a household there under circumstances she described, when Agnesot asked directly, but gently, only as involving a disagreement with her former mistress that had left her without proper reference or continued employment. This explanation, ordinary enough on its own terms and consistent with a common pattern of medieval servant employment that surviving records confirm, involved considerable turnover and occasional acrimonious departures between servants and the households that employed them, nonetheless struck Agnesot as carrying a certain rehearsed, overly smooth quality that her own recent, frightening experience had left her considerably less inclined to accept at simple face value than she might have been only a day before. Christiana, sharing a brief, careful glance with Agnes, thought that neither woman needed words to interpret, steered the conversation gently toward the specific timing of Editha's arrival in the village, learning that the stranger had, in fact, arrived only the previous afternoon, mere hours before the storm that had brought such strange trouble to both Agnesot and Christiana's separate households descended in full force, a timing that offered no definitive proof of any connection whatsoever, since genuine coincidence remained entirely possible and even likely given how many ordinary travelers moved through villages exactly like did this one during the course of any given season, yet that nonetheless left both women exchanging a further wordless glance carrying the same cautious, unresolved suspicion neither felt fully prepared to voice aloud to a stranger they had known for mere minutes. The owl wife herself, overhearing enough of this careful exchange to offer her own practical contribution, mentioned that she did indeed know of one household potentially in need of additional labor, that of the miller and his wife at the village's western edge, a suggestion Editha received with evident, genuine relief and gratitude that struck Agnesot as difficult to reconcile with any darker purpose, though she reminded herself, walking home alone through the afternoon's fading light, once this careful information-gathering encounter finally concluded, that genuine relief at securing needed employment and some other, less innocent purpose and ire early were not, in fact, mutually exclusive possibilities, and that she would need considerably more evidence than a single, ambiguous conversation before she could reasonably judge whether Editha's arrival represented the answer to the mystery now troubling both her own household and Christiana's, or simply an unconnected stranger whose unfortunate timing had merely added an unnecessary, misleading complication to a danger whose true source remained. As the day's fading light gave way once more to the deepening cold, all another Underton winter night, genuinely and entirely unknown. Thank you for listening. Please subscribe and give a comment.